Welcome, Ben.
Hey, Sam.
Excited to be here with you again. I mean, I guess we did do one podcast together.
Sure.
Over in Utah, but
It was more of a casual lean back.
yeah. Although hopefully this one is a more casual conversation because we don't have camera crew and the whole setup, and have more time, I think, to really just dig into all the different topics. But before we jump into these, I have a question that I've actually wondered myself for a while. I've been waiting to ask you. And you're a world-leading expert in insulin resistance, insulin general, the hormone. And I want to know when in your education you decided, hey, I want insulin to be my focus. And all the things that a biochemist could, you're studying and focus on. Why did you pick this?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. It's fun for me, actually, to be able to answer it. So when we have to go back in time, of course, a little ways. As I was nearing the end of my undergraduate degree, anticipating a future career, it was a little bit of a early life crisis, to be perfectly frank. It was the most daunting point I'd ever found myself in. We talk about, marriage and other big life choices, and we don't talk a lot about how to narrow down a career path, because I felt like every option was ahead of me. And so it became a matter of tremendous thought, meditation, analysis, prayer. Boy, I just devoted every speck of brain power I could to trying to help a path become clearer. And then the one path that really unexpectedly came to my mind was pursue the path of becoming a professor and a scientist and an academic. And that was very unexpected, but very clear. And so I did. And I got my first master's degree, which in the sciences, it's a dirty little secret of the sciences that a master's degree is essentially a placeholder. You don't quite know what you want to do yet. It's not like an MBA or one of those practical.
My wife got a master's degree.
Yeah, and it really is just a placeholder. It is just basically a way for you to justify taking a little longer to make a decision. And so I did my master's degree in exercise physiology, thinking, having always been involved in athletics, I should say, lest this sound like I'm complimenting myself. I'd been involved in athletics. I loved the challenge of getting faster and stronger. And I was increasingly curious about what is the process that goes into a muscle becoming bigger and better, faster, stronger. And so at the time, during my master's degree, I had anticipated going into muscle as my kind of tissue of research and exercise. It was exercise physiology as my master's degree, after all. But then I came across one paper. I promise I'm getting to the...
Yeah.
No. So I came across one manuscript that had been published by a group out of Harvard, where this group documented how fat tissue was the bridge, because of what it produces, the bridge between obesity and diabetes. So there was a sort of, in the early 2000s, this kind of explosion of enthusiasm to try to understand this double epidemic of diabesity. What is the confluence of obesity and diabetes? What is it about obesity that is causing type 2 diabetes, or even vice versa, type 2 diabetes that's contributing to obesity? All they knew really was that, boy, where one went, the other followed. And this group out of Harvard found that fat tissue, as it expanded, became very pro-inflammatory, that it was literally leaking inflammatory proteins, what we could call those hormones. A hormone is any protein or any signal coming from one tissue to another tissue. And that was the mechanism that they found that if they could block that inflammation, the type 2 diabetes went away. In particular, something called insulin resistance went away. So that one single manuscript was absolutely pivotal in my future. I had no idea just how impactful it was at the time. And it was so elucidating because it taught me that, one, fat tissue is an endocrine organ. It is a hormone-secreting organ. I had no idea. I had no idea that fat tissue made hormones. That was so cool to me, because when I thought about hormones, I would think about the thyroid gland or the adrenal glands. These kind of...
I think most people think puberty.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they think the gonad, testes or ovaries. No one appreciates the fact that the fat tissue produces dozens, if not hundreds, of hormones. And it essentially is setting a metabolic tone for the rest of the body. So that was a revelation, finding that fat tissue made hormones. It was a revelation finding that those hormones would cause inflammation, which would then cause insulin resistance, which then caused type 2 diabetes. That was it. At that moment, I thought, I want to study this. I want to study how fat tissue is causing insulin resistance, and that leading to type 2 diabetes. And then that was, I remember as a PhD student then, so I finished my master's degree, go on to get a PhD in a field called bioenergetics, so the study of metabolism, kind of a union of physiology, which is a study of the body's systems, and biochemistry, which you mentioned at the outset. And I was at this conference, and then a friend, fellow PhD student, says to me, as we were going out for a morning jog, he says, hey, are you going to go to this session about Alzheimer's disease and type 3 diabetes? And I asked him, his name's Dan, I said, Dan, what are you talking about? What's type 3 diabetes? And he says, oh, well, that's a term they're using to describe the connection between type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's disease. And I thought, what are you talking about? Alzheimer's disease is a disease of plaques in the brain. Everybody knows this. And so just that planted, again, another little seed of curiosity, or once again, a little nudge along this professional pathway, where I went to this session and everyone's talking about insulin resistance of the brain. And that was, again, a revelation among a handful that I've mentioned, realizing that what I thought was a problem of type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, was also a problem with Alzheimer's disease. And that was the beginning of me kind of going on this pursuit of just asking myself, okay, what else does insulin resistance cause? Oh, hey, wouldn't you know it? It's the leading cause of high blood pressure, which is the main problem with heart disease. What else? Oh, it's the leading cause of fatty liver disease, which is the most common liver problem worldwide. It's also the leading cause of infertility in men and women. And it just kept going.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking, no one's going to believe me. Like, it sounds like I'm suggesting all of these, what I like to call the plagues of prosperity, all of these chronic diseases that are new, that are diseases of civilization, we've looked at them in their individual little silos, that one has nothing to do with the other. In reality, while they each do certainly have distinct noxious stimuli or distinct origins, they all at least have one common influence, and that is insulin resistance, which certainly helped me continue to be enthusiastic about the topic. But at the end of it all, including, in fact, at the end of this conversation today, one of the hopes I have is imagining the average individual who opens their medicine cabinet every morning and they take out a medication for their diabetes, or 2 or 3, a medication or 2 for their blood pressure, a medication for their infertility, a medication for their migraine headaches, and then learning later that they're not all separate problems, that you can, in many instances, literally just make one correction, namely improving your insulin resistance, making the body more insulin sensitive, helping your insulin levels come down, and those medications stay in the bottle and the medicine cabinet stays closed. Because each of those problems that I just mentioned, and many more, do have a common origin and are heavily influenced by one variable. That is powerful, and it influences, I think, not only clinical practice, but also just individual decisions. So that was the evolution of how I got to studying insulin resistance. It was a very odd pathway. But as an academic now, something you and I have talked about before, my greatest hope is finding ways to take the best ideas that have only been living in peer-reviewed science articles that no one will ever read. You know, there's all kinds of wonderful scientists publishing all kinds of wonderful work, some of which is actually relevant.
Yeah.
And even that relevant information is behind a paywall in a science peer-reviewed journal that no one will ever read.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this with the Skin in the Game book.
Exactly. Right. Yep. Yet that after I reached the point of tenure at BYU, that was when I decided, all right, what is my kind of second mountain? What is the next thing I want to achieve? And it became, I need to promote an awareness of this because no one was talking about it. And unfortunately, most approaches to improving health we're actually making it worse.
So when you decided, okay, insulin is the thing, right? This is where I'm focusing on. And you start to realize how inflammatory of a topic that is because of how it goes against the grain. Did you ever think, oh, maybe this is what I want to focus on or make my career on?
Yeah, well, there are some interesting dynamics that I've never really, or that I rarely bring up, but even within academia, and maybe because so much in academia is so unimportant, people are so determined to defend what they think they know.
Yeah, I've heard of the drama at BYU, like from my cousin, where I took a class of how she had other professors who would make comments about Dr. Bikman.
This heretic professor. Yeah, it's certainly not unique to my university. It is a common theme, and there's in fact an incredibly rich history from the 1950s of various scientific characters kind of hijacking the message, if you will, and really making it kind of almost more of a PR campaign rather than allowing arguments to be evaluated on the basis of just the data. What's the substance of the argument? So yeah, I didn't anticipate that I was reaping a whirlwind here, but what has left me more optimistic is that for every fiery dart that has been launched my way, there is just this tremendous ability that I have, in addition to just a growing community and body of literature, that I can defend myself. And even at the time, I would think, what I'm about to say, is this something that I could defend in a formal setting by citing the best, most rigorous peer-reviewed studies? And if I couldn't meet that criteria, I wouldn't say it. Or I would say, well, I have to speculate. I would put that caveat there. But yeah, at the end of it all, my motivation in the midst of frustrating challenges continues unabated because the evidence is so convincing. It is so overwhelming. And too few people, especially at the time, were willing to talk about it. Or, not only willing, but weren't familiar enough, weren't educated enough to talk about it.
I think, and really that's still the case on the large scale. Right? Like there was this video I saw on X of your friend Nina, right? Dr. Teicholz. And it was this little clip of her talking at some conference, sharing, right, how we now know for the last 10 years that by changing this lifestyle in your diet and moving low carbohydrate, that 50% of people in like a clinically controlled study, right, reverse their type 2 diabetes, not in years, but in like weeks or months.
Yeah. The changes are so fast in type 2 diabetes in particular that people have to have almost real-time monitoring by their clinical team in order to start deprescribing medications. Yeah. And that's a term that doesn't even exist in the conventional clinical mind. Deprescribing? What are you talking about? Yeah. And this is reflected even further in the kind of clinical view, which is average clinicians will say type 2 diabetes is an irreversible disease. Because if you leave that doctor's office with a prescription for a drug, it is irreversible. That medication will only ever treat symptoms. It will never address the root cause. But type 2 diabetes is a disease of lifestyle. The food we eat in that particular context, and almost everything related to insulin resistance, is either the culprit or the cure. Yeah. And the good news is, if it's been the culprit in someone, well, then some changes can move it over to being the cure. But it is a disease of lifestyle.
Yeah, and like the most dramatic thing from the clip was just her pointing out, like, you haven't read about this in any newspapers, right? You haven't seen it on any news, right? Any mainstream media. No documentaries are talking about this, right? And you have to like get on X and find these, growing communities, but still obscure on the grand scale.
Yep. Oh, and still very open to criticism. One thing that I have wondered about as I've gotten older and more familiar and more steeped in all of the literature here is just wondering at the conflict between the voices. Like, there are those of us who are saying, no, there's substantial evidence and has been for decades that there's a different view. And who opposes that? And more, I can't help but wonder, this sounds conspiratorial, but I think, why are you opposing this? In the face of so much convincing clinical evidence, what do you gain by continuing this opposition? And I do think as conspiratorial as it sounds, we would be better served by wondering, what are the conflicts? Why might this group, why might this entity, this organization, this individual be saying, oh no, don't listen to these people here. It's not a disease of lifestyle. It's genetics. You're born this way. There's nothing you can do but take our medication.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, incentives explain everything.
Yes.
All right. It's like you look at the incentives and, oh, well, now I understand.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not, I try and be generous because I think people are inherently good.
Yeah.
And so I don't look at like big pharma and say this is a corrupt, evil industry. I think it's an industry that has the wrong incentives. And incentives are to only make profit for the shareholders in the company. And the best way to do that is get people on a medication as young as possible and keep them on it as long as possible.
Yeah. Well, boy, we see that now. You look at the explosion in more recent medications, and I don't want to push the conversation too far too quickly, but the current use of some of the most popular medications is essentially an assurance to have these people use the medication for the rest of their life. I mean, it is an incredibly brilliant model of making money where the people are becoming enslaved to the use of these drugs in order, in this case, to say have their metabolic health improve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so much going on right now with this. It seemed like we were on this, as a nation, an incredibly slippery slope, the direction things were heading, right? And now you have this total vibe shift in the direction. I mean, like, just, was it yesterday that they announced about the red?
Oh, yeah, the red dye.
Red dye that's finally, illegal after 35 years, after it was illegal in cosmetics.
Yeah.
It caused cancer. Now we can't
look what damage it has wreaked in the meantime. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, it's very exciting to see people in the health, aspect who are healthy.
Yep.
Someone like RFK Jr. Yep. Who, controversial person, but at the end of the day, it's super clear he wants to help people be healthier.
Yeah. Okay.
And he's not trapped up in these incentives that have pushed things along. But he's finding a big obstacle, and there's already been a ton of work, especially on this new rush of pharmaceutical drugs that have created it's statin drugs 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago. Now it's pushing the GLP-1.
Yes.
And so you had sent me and Dan a message a couple weeks ago that I thought was really interesting. We'll probably want to talk, full spectrum on the GLP-1s. At least give a high level, explanation. Yeah. But that message about how it relates to mental health.
Oh, why? Yes. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting topic.
Yeah. Well, then you've unleashed me. So I'll go at it. Yeah. So just by way of background, I would want everyone to understand. I'm a professor, so I always look for an opportunity to teach something. First of all, let me just make sure people appreciate that GLP-1 is a hormone, glucagon-like peptide. It is in the family of peptide hormone, which is an interesting fact of physiology, but also dictates how the drug can be used. You can't orally take a peptide. You have to inject it. But GLP-1 is a hormone that is made by the small intestine. Everyone makes it. And it has a host of good benefits. It can act at the brain to tell the brain that the body is full. It stimulates those satiety centers. It also acts at the guts to kind of complement that effect by slowing peristalsis or delaying the rate at which food is moving through. Naturally, that also elicits a satiety effect, because if we go eat a meal, what would normally have stayed in our stomach for 4 to 6 hours now could stay there for 20 to 24 hours. So we just really will feel full. There's sort of this bulk of something within the stomach that's just not really moving. So naturally, we don't want to eat as much. That is, and then one other effect I ought to mention, because it actually harkens back to the first use of GLP-1 as a therapy, as a drug therapy, which is that GLP-1 also inhibits the production of a hormone called glucagon. So now we have one hormone kind of opposing another. The benefit in that regard is that in type 2 diabetes and type 1, as much as we always look at the glucose and sometimes we look at the insulin, we could also include glucagon in that framework because glucagon's too high. And glucagon is the yang to insulin's yin, whereas insulin wants to lower blood glucose. Glucagon wants to increase it. In diabetes, type 1 and type 2, glucagon is too high. And so the person constantly has this pressure from glucagon telling the body, the liver specifically, that we need to be releasing glucose into the blood. So it's always pushing blood glucose up. So at these more physiological lower levels, GLP-1 inhibits glucagon, which in turn helps blood glucose come down. Thus, it is an anti-diabetic therapy when it was first used. And that is how it was first used. So some of the origin even further there was that people found that if someone had had gastric bypass surgery, their type 2 diabetes would go away in like a week. And they found that one of the changes was that this hormone, GLP-1, just came out of nowhere. It just went from very, very low levels. And that is something that happens in obesity. You have a lean person, an obese person, they go eat a meal. The lean person will have a much bigger increase in GLP-1 than the obese person. So that is a relevant reason or a justifiable reason to say, all right, well, let's target GLP-1. I can understand that. And so they find post-gastric bypass, holy smokes, GLP-1 levels have just spiked more than ever before, and that could be why their blood glucose levels are so much improved and why, by an extension, the type 2 diabetes is gone.
Yeah.
So all of this sort of led to the development of drugs, saying, okay, when this hormone goes up, good things happen. All right, well, let's take advantage of that. And that was the beginning, the birth of the GLP-1 receptor agonists. Now, another point of endocrinology here is that the word agonist means basically an activator. So these are drugs that are acting like GLP-1 by stimulating the same cellular receptors that GLP-1 would stimulate.
Yeah, it's kind of like they're going in and flipping the switch.
That's right. Yeah.
Without the body doing it itself.
That's right. Yep. And so that was the first use. The first use of these GLP-1 drugs was in the context of diabetes. And it was used at a relatively modest dose. But opportunistic individuals, I can't fault them for this, saw, oh, wait, these people also tend to eat a little less and they lose a little bit of weight. What happens if we increase the dose? And sure enough, that effect, what had just originally been an inhibition of the alpha cells making glucagon, now became an inhibition of the hunger signal in the brain and an inhibition of the rate at which food is moving through the guts. So it really started playing into you're eating less. Now weight loss really started moving. Now, however, that is all of the good. I teach my students that whenever it comes to any drug, it is this balance of consequences where you have to ask, the clinician must ask this, the patient must ask this. Are the consequences I want worth the consequences I don't want? Not enough people are talking about that, and you've alluded to a huge issue there. So I've just elaborated the consequences we want part of this balance. But to keep a balanced conversation, and because too few people are talking about this, including very influential people on social media, I've never seen anything like it. No one would ever brag about being on a statin to control their lipids. No one would ever brag about being on a blood pressure medication. And yet people are bragging about being on these weight loss.
It's such an interesting thing because it's like a departure from what I consider like part of American culture, which is like, hey, the most valuable things are stuff that I worked hard.
Oh, yes.
But we've had such a shift in culture that now someone like, hey, I used this, G code.
Yep.
And got it. How cool is that?
Yeah.
And so you get people like, even people I really respect, like Elon Musk, who's really pushing it out there.
Yes.
And I've seen us in the comments.
Yeah.
It's like wincing. Like, oh.
Yes. Yeah, and I do, where it is, you're absolutely right. I love that you just said that because I totally agree. One of the things that is a point of pride for me as a non-American born individual, now American, I think it is a defining attribute of this sort of roll up your sleeves and get it done. That is a really kind of quintessential American attribute. But more and more, it is like these former kind of stoic values of just self-discipline. Now it's, well, here's my self-discipline in a syringe. And I think we lose something. We lose something in depriving ourselves of lessons, but the bill comes due. And that's reflected in some of the negative consequences of these drugs. The one just because of relevance, mentioning the mental health, where a study has found that in users of the GLP-1 drugs controlled to a placebo group, they are 105% or so, 106% more a greater risk of having severe depression, like major depression syndrome. And they are, or it was 105% increased risk of suicidal behavior. That's what it was. And then it was 195% greater risk of major depression. That's what it was. So huge. Often in human studies, you'll say, oh, well, it reached a significant p-value, but secretly we know, well, it was a relative change of like 5%, and so that doesn't mean anything. No, we're talking 100 up to 200% change in the risk of, again, suicidality, about 100% increased risk, or double, and then 200, so triple the risk with major depression on the use of these drugs. This is, when I saw those data, as much as it made me groan in sadness, I also was validated, because one of the messages I have taught was that while people extol the value of the food noise is gone, I don't have a craving for food anymore, they also don't have a craving for anything. So there are a lot of anecdotal reports, and that's what I was sort of looking at, but the numbers just became so convincing that any interests, like let's say you have an interest in video games, well, not on that drug, you don't. A man may have an interest in being affectionate with his wife. Well, that went away on the use of that drug. So whatever the person was craving or passionate about, everything just sort of turned gray on the use of, and that, to me, that evidence is a perfect manifestation of that.
It's mind-boggling. It's so, like, 'cause that's so disastrous. You look at, like, take someone like me. Okay, my joys in life, I have my family, I'm spending time with my wife, with my kids. I have food. I love to eat good food, great steak, like things like that.
Yep.
You've got going out skiing, you've got reading, right? Fantasy, science fiction.
People that want to play pickleball.
Yeah. Well, so you have all these things, and all of a sudden you start taking this drug, which has been cranked up so high.
Yes.
Right? It's like the Spinal Tap of we cranked it up to 11.
Exactly.
You get the results. And now, not only, right, am I less interested in the food, which might have been my goal. Okay, I know this food obsession is not a good thing for me.
Yes.
So I wanted that. But also now it's like, I don't know if I stand to get off the couch, get off my phone, and spend time with my kids and family.
Yep.
Going skiing would be fun, but that seems like a lot of work.
Yes.
So I just don't want it. And at the end of the day, it's like, I didn't change. I would still have fun doing those things. Like, I need that fulfillment, but I don't have the drive to go get it.
Yeah. No, it's
and so then, you just find yourself depressed. The same way that, like, locking you away from all the things they find joy in life, and they get depressed.
Yeah, everything, all of the enthusiasm, all of the peaks of enjoyment and hobbies and habits, they all level out. But this is one of the reasons, of course. That is a drum we need to beat very loudly, because we are in the midst, especially with the ending of COVID lockdowns. Mental health was already at an all-time low, especially in younger people. And the fact that even younger people are taking these drugs, it's just continuing to create, it's pouring fuel on the flames of this crisis of mental health. But even then, even with the apparent benefit being the food noise is gone, my cravings are better, a paper was published called the Step 5 trial, which found the semaglutide use, and it found that as you looked at an individual's sweet cravings, which is the thing they report the most improvement with, right? It's like every evening, which is when most people are at their weakest with diet, they would crave ice cream or cookies or cakes or some kinds of treats. That at 20 weeks, so about a half a year on the drug, 6 months-ish, their sweet cravings just plummeted. They just were able to look at the temptation and walk away from it. At 1 year, 12 months, it had started to come back up. At 2 years, it was right back where it started. So even on 2 years of ongoing use of the drug, the main benefit, which is that I'm not as tempted by food, was gone. Even further, within the United States, 70% of patients who go on the drug at 2 years get off. They don't want to be on it anymore. They self-deprescribe. And we don't know the exact reasons, but one of them is certainly because they get tired of feeling sick. because part of what is helping the person not eat as much is that they have an almost constant nausea. No surprise. Food is sitting in their guts for up to 4 or 5 times longer than it should. It's creating noxious little stinky fumes, so they're burping and their breath stinks all the time from the food just sitting in the stomach. So 70% of users will get off at 2 years. And of course, that's coinciding with and maybe playing into why, but the cravings are coming back. They may be looking at this and saying, look, it's not working anymore. I'm just going to get off the drug. But at the same time, still compounding all of this, a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine found that up to 40% of the weight that these people are losing is coming from lean mass. And so collectively,
you can any guy, that's such a pain.
Well, it's catastrophic. But I mean, it's catastrophic for 2 relatively thin guys who want to do anything you can to keep muscle. But imagine a 60-year-old woman who struggled with being overweight. You and I would maybe, you're younger than I am, you'd have a chance of regaining some of that lean mass. You know, maybe we're active enough and we have testosterone helping that we wouldn't lose quite as much. But let's look at a middle-aged or older woman who naturally has a harder time building and retaining lean mass because of relatively lower levels of testosterone in particular. Now in her, let's imagine she's been losing weight. For every 10 pounds of weight she's losing, 6 is fat, 4 is not fat. Then eventually, either through diminishing returns of the drug, or it's becoming less effective, and or she just gets off the drug, she has lost these 2 parts of her body, fat mass and fat-free mass. Well, naturally, when someone stops the drug, weight rebounds very, very quickly. But now it's not a stretch to imagine what rebounds more quickly or more readily than the other variable. Well, of course, fat mass. The human body has no problem gaining fat mass back, but especially in a middle-aged or older woman, not to mention an older man as well, of course. It would still apply to him too. Their ability to gain that lean mass back could be gone forever. And so now even if the person, let's say they lose 50 pounds, over 2 years, they get off the drug and they gain 40 back. They may say, well, at least I'm still 10 pounds lighter. Yeah, but you're probably fatter.
Yeah,
that's an actual percent of your body.
That's what I was just doing. Like someone who's, let's say you have a woman, she's overweight, she's 190 pounds.
Yes.
And so she says, hey, I want to get healthy. I want to get back down to 140 pounds. And so she gets on this, and over the course of 2 years, drops 50 pounds. Yeah, she's lost 20 pounds of lean mass. That's bone and muscle.
Yes.
And know it's very sobering. Past a certain age, like you're not getting that.
That's not coming back.
It's not getting that.
No. But fat mass, no problem. It's happy to come back. And in fact, maybe just one last little cherry on top to just beat a dead horse. One of the versions of these GLP-1 drugs called liraglutide has been shown to activate a gene in fat cells called PPAR gamma. Now, what's the relevance of PPAR gamma? It's when PPAR gamma is activated, it stimulates fat cells to reproduce. And so even in the midst of all this weight loss, the fat cells are shrinking, the drug could be stimulating the fat cells to multiply. Now, the person may say, well, then that's a paradox. How are they losing weight? It's because fat mass is a function of the size of the fat cells, not the number of fat cells necessarily. But what's happened is, at least with the use of one of these drugs, they have more fat cells than they did before, but they're all smaller. Thus, they've lost weight. But where there are more fat cells, there is a greater potential for fat mass. And so it's entirely possible that as they start to regain the fat once they get off the drug or the drug is becoming less effective, their ability to not only regain but then go beyond is greater than before they ever started. They have expanded their reservoir of fat retaining capacity, all in an effort to initially lose weight and do what they just didn't quite have enough education combined with a little bit of discipline, but discipline benefits with proper education.
Yeah, and it's twofold because it's like, one, I've got more fat cells, and so if I get them to the same size, I'm fatter than I was before. But the other thing is I have a lower metabolic rate, so if I have less muscle, less drives up it. And so I could, no, it's a perfect storm, right? I can go and eat a recommended amount for me before, but now that my body fat percentage is so out of whack, it's like, oh wait, why am I getting fatter?
Right.
Like this is what I was told to do.
And that's because you generally are going to go back to the habits you had before. And because the person's not learned to eat. And
their environment hasn't changed.
That's right. They've not learned the skills or the true self-discipline to look at something and say, no, you're not good for me. And while I'm craving you right now, I have learned the consequences of eating you, and I'm just going to say no. They've not learned how to think through that process. But underlying all of this is an indictment of our food environment, of course. There are 3 macronutrients: proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. In all of the neurobiology of addiction research that has happened with humans only show addiction to one of those. There's no evidence of addiction to protein. No one is looking at whey protein and making a line and snorting whey protein. No one, that's a crass way to describe it. No one's just scooping whey protein and just rolling their eyes into an ecstasy. Similarly, no one is eating sticks of butter on a Friday night while they're watching a movie.
My daughter does do that, but can't make me proud of her.
Yes, embrace it. May it last long. But people aren't craving fat. No one is getting a bottle of olive oil and sipping on it with a straw. We crave something sweet and gooey or salty and crunchy. It is carbohydrates that humans have shown an addiction for. And in our environment, we've been vilifying fat for 70 years while embracing carbohydrates as the better of the 2 macronutrients, saying, well, it's just a matter of calories, and fat has more calories than carbs, and so let's just focus on the carbs. One, that is the thing that we get addicted to. And 2, that is the one thing that increases insulin more, back to the kind of beginning of the conversation. We want to try to live a life that is keeping insulin generally lower. Now, there's going to be times where it comes up, and that's totally fine. But the more that's happening, the higher it's going to be. So we want to try to avoid insulin spikes, but that's the one thing we're craving. And then one final point, I guess, that I rail against with kind of dietetics, the nutrition science field. I don't know what is in their schooling that can't allow them to just say, no, that's bad, or be really careful with that. They are so enamored by this line, this maxim, moderation in all things. Boy, they love to say that. Don't think that sugar's bad. Moderation in all things. Well, would you ever say that to an alcoholic? We're going out in a buddy, we're all going to go to the bar. I know you and I have never had a drink of alcohol in our lives, but let's just go with the story. We're going out to a bar, and we have a friend. I'm an alcoholic, and you say to me, Ben, why are you not drinking? Come on, just have 1 glass. Moderation in all things.
And you're like, Sam, I've been sober for 3
I
months.
can't. Yeah, that's the problem, and too many people don't realize. They don't realize the difference between an addict and a moderator when it comes to nutrition. Most people can go drink alcohol and be perfectly fine with it, but there are a subset of people who cannot. Similarly, we know humans have addictive tendencies towards carbohydrates. Why are we telling them, you're overweight, you're insulin resistant, you're diabetic? Well, just eat a little bit of it, then stop.
Yeah.
No, this person's disease, in fact, may have been caused by their carbohydrate addiction. It would be better. There is a Catholic saint who had a line that I love. It's a maxim for me, which is abstinence is easier than perfect moderation. And there are people who should be told, don't even start. You will be stronger if you look at that little pint of Ben & Jerry's with all of its seductive sweetness. It's better for you to not even pop open that lid than it is to start telling yourself, I'll just have a few bites. No, you won't. You're an addict.
Yeah.
Once that comes off, you're going all the way to the bottom. And I'm sympathetic to that because I feel that in my own behavior. And so the reason I've maintained reasonably good metabolic health is I'm mindful of my addictions, and I know it's better if I don't even start because I can't moderate because I'm an addict. Some people are moderators. My wife is a moderator. She has this almost alien-like ability to open a little pint of ice cream, eat a few dainty little bites, and put the lid back on. I can't do that. Like, I'll not only eat my pint, but I will have my eye on hers, and I will finish hers off the moment she leaves the room.
Yeah. It's the same exact situation with my wife. She'll make a batch of cookies, and if those stick around, if they're not given to a neighbor, they're not ever bad. I will eat them all up. I inherited from my dad. And so I will live a much stricter regimen for my nutrition than she does. Yeah, because she has this natural, ability to say no. And I think just this taste for how she feels when you use too much. Yeah, it really sensitive to it. Whereas I'm like, Yeah, it's true. That 8 cookies made me feel a little off, but
I loved it.
But tomorrow morning, I'll still want you more.
Yeah, I'm going to do it again tomorrow.
Yeah.
No, I know. That is really, even like there's this kind of cycle of, oh, I shouldn't have done that, but I'm going to do it again. Yeah, I shouldn't have done that, but I'm going to do it again. Now, some people are able to just have the foresight or listen to the cues a little better, and we are not one of them. And so the key is, and I think that is a message that needs to be shared. And critical to even the whole conversation in GLP-1s, this is something that maybe as a drug, in its best use, it is in someone who, even with getting proper education, which is, hey, look, control your carbs. Stop getting your carbs out of bags and boxes with barcodes. Make sure you're prioritizing protein and don't fear the fat that comes with that protein. That is the nutrition messaging that needs to happen rather than just eat less, exercise more. No, all that's going to do is make you really hungry. You're not actually addressing true nutrition. So with correct nutritional principles in coaching, if they still can't do it, okay, now maybe there's an opportunity for these drugs, or even better, perhaps, it's to educate them on GLP-1, educate them about the consequences, and say, how about we explore strategies to increase your own GLP-1? That then enables them to continue to live in the real world, to swim in all the normal waters of reality, and learn how to cope. Learn for where the safe passage is, where the safe shores are, rather than just saying, oh, no, we're going to artificially circle you around with some safety, and then someday that's going to be gone and good luck.
Yeah. And I want to talk about, our approach on how we equip people with the tools to leverage their natural production.
Yeah.
And all this. But at the risk of a tangent, it's totally might take us another direction. Right. I think in the food environment issue, most people don't understand how deep the problem goes. Like the roots of this issue are so far beyond what we have an ability to impact.
Yeah.
Because, you've got the incentives of all these big food companies, which, hey, we want to sell as much of our product to that. Well, people can only eat so much. So how do we do that? Well, we got to find ways to make them hungrier more often, make our food less satiating, bring our costs down. And that's where it becomes, to me, I think, really sinister and can almost feel hopeless. I mean, this morning I was as I did my workout, I was listening to a video on X about what is the problem with our money, right? And so they're talking about, because of how every government behaves with their currency of, pressing their big red button to print more currency.
Yeah.
And it debases this. And so that gives the companies a choice. Hey, we can either choose to fire some of our employees, or we can choose to charge more money for our products, or we can choose to reduce the cost of our products.
Yeah.
And so that's where you start having all these big food companies say, we don't want to charge more. Ideally, we can keep our Lay's, chips, and all these things as cheap as possible, but we can't be making them with premium ingredients anymore. We got to go find options for this more industrialized sludge that we're going to start building these products out of, because, it actually helps the food be more addictive.
Yeah.
And this will be able to buy more of it, but it brings our costs down.
Yeah.
And so we're in this process and ultra processed food environment that is setting from how our actual countries are being met.
Well, and even further, a further indictment, this makes me sound maybe too libertarian, and I don't think we want to get too much into politics, although I'm happy to into those.
It's fun.
It is a further indictment of the regulation or the involvement of government. You'd started with the idea of a government inflating currency, probably not by design, but it's a consequence of practices and it's yes, currency. That's right.
I don't want to lose the election.
No, right.
And so I've got this big red button. I'll earn more money. Push comes to shove.
Consequences will be down the road, and I don't have to deal with that. But even when it comes to food, it's not just a corporate or a private industry issue, because the government will subsidize various industries to then incentivize, just based on pure finances, the company. Like so many of these soybeans, boy, that soybean oil wouldn't be quite so cheap if the government wasn't incentivizing the growth of soybeans. Putting refined starches, wheat and corn, well, the government's subsidizing those too. Where there is no subsidy is in the realm of, that's real food. That's steak and eggs.
The only cruise shows today is ribeyes.
Yeah, and or just get out entirely.
It's better.
Like it's just the more we have. I mean, this is once again a very kind of American view. Like, you don't tell me what to do. Let me decide what I need to do. Not that this is a libertarian kind of laissez-faire society, and I don't think that works anyway. But let the level of regulation be as close to the individual as possible. Like, in my ideal scenario is, like, even something like sugar. People would think, oh, Ben, you must be a huge advocate of sugar bans. I'm actually not, because I don't want an external entity telling me what to do. What I think the solution is how can it all comes down to the family. Every big decision, it's the family that creates society, which creates the country or the nation. What the focus should be is how can we properly educate families, parents, so that the decisions are changing. That will then influence the market. And then all of a sudden, a company will say, okay, that's not working. We've been using these ingredients because they were so affordable, because they're subsidized, but people don't want them.
Yeah.
All right, well, then we have to do something else. Like, it's rather than having the government tell the companies what to do,
The market should be size. Yes. Right.
and then that level of education at the family is what allows things to change. So my greatest hope would be, if we're going to devote money and resources to anything, don't devote it to making new laws and banning sugar. Even some of the new focus of saying we're going to ban high fructose corn syrup and force everyone to use real sugar. Oh, that's a very, very modest win. They're not really going to do anything. Sure, real sugar, well, if it's raw sugar, it may have some other micronutrients, some vitamins in it. But other than that, the person's going to likely get just as fat and sick as they were before. So even with some of the new fervor around health, I think some of it's a little misdirected. But even still, more resources should be focused on education. How can we help the family unit start to make changes? That then will alter buying habits in the market. So back to what you said, let the market decide.
Yeah.
Don't let the government pick and choose who it wants to win. That's not fair. That's not right. And it only ever leads to disaster.
Yeah. I mean, again, yesterday there's an announcement from the Steak and Shakes, which, I've never heard of them before. I don't know where they have a bunch of restaurants, but they say, hey, we're going 100% tallow for our fries and everything.
Yeah, there is an interesting history. Anyone could look at a podcast by the guy who wrote the book. Oh my gosh, he's an economist. Wrote about the evolution. It was a kind of a short podcast series about the evolution of McDonald's fries. He's the one who wrote the book Outliers. Malcolm Gladwell.
Oh yeah, Malcolm.
Yeah. So he had this little short podcast series trying to not only going through some of the controversy in the early 1950s and 60s about the vilification of saturated fats in favor of seed oils, or what they call vegetable oils, but then the evolution in the market and how that influenced companies like McDonald's, who, having gone from tallow, which is a saturated fat, which has a crispness to it or a solidness to it at room temperature, allowing the fries to be more crispy. It was their kind of scientific hurdle of taking a fat that's always in an oil state and how they could use that and not have their fries be just a soggy mush. So all the technology and all the chemistry that went into that, and then it was his effort then to try to find fries. And I think he actually went to McDonald's headquarters and had them make some in the original tallow formula and then make some with the new seed oil formula, and him just noting how much more delicious and crispy and the flavor of them. It's actually an incredibly nice series. I listened to it years ago, so I can't remember what it was even called. But to see this return, maybe it does hint at a future where the government does start to say, hey, okay, we're not picking favorite industries anymore. Market, you just have total control, which is the way it ought to be, because we're the ones who know what we want. We're the ones who know what's best. We don't need someone to tell us.
Yeah, and I don't think it was a moral decision on behalf of Steak and Shakes, right?
Yep.
They're looking at this. They're sensing their buying
trend.
And they're saying, hey, I think if we do this is a marketing play. We're the first people to really announce that we're adopting this, and it's going to bring people to our stores.
And it worked. I hope.
Yeah, I'll certainly get, because it works. Like, please go. If you happen to have one near, like, once this is official in February, support them. Bring your balance, because still fries are not the best in the year. But, you know.
You got to kind of balance out those carbs somehow.
Definitely. Which brings us right to using tools.
Mm-hmm.
Because I want to make this distinction between we've bashed a little bit on the idea of ignoring consequences when it comes to these medications that you're using and pharmaceutical enhancements. But at the same time, it's not like even with the idea of roll up your sleeves and get it done, you still want to use the advantages that exist that can help you make progress.
Yes, yeah. Why leave a tool on the bench if you can pick it up and use it?
Yeah. And so a big part, like touching on removing the joy from life that you get from these excessive, doses of GLP-1 agonists. I mean, our goal is to add zest into life.
Yeah.
Like, there's a great quote from our CEO where he says, one of the biggest strategies today is not that we have less years in our life, but that we have less life in our years. And we want to say, okay, how can we help people add more life into their years?
Yeah.
You're going to live a long life. And we'd rather have that be a long life full of just all the things you love in life.
Yes.
And that zest for it. And so that's why, for me, Unicity is the best supplement I've ever found. I'm very biased. But despite that, right, this is serving a similar purpose to what people are trying to get, right, unnaturally through injections.
Yeah.
And yet somehow this is like adding more zest into my life. And can you help us understand like some of the different mechanics in that, right, the natural consequences from this?
Yeah, oh, for sure. Yeah, in fact, first of all, let me just say I love that sentiment by Stewart with regards to, it's reflected even in literature where we're living longer, and yet what that is accounting for, actually until recently, life expectancy has in fact started to turn back. But we're living longer in a sick state. So it's really more of a complement to healthcare, which is we can keep you alive longer. But you'll need interventions to stay alive. And so that, I think, in a way is reflected in that sentiment of you want to square the curve when it comes to life. You want to live healthy and capable and functional, and then you get second diet. Rather than you turn 50 and, you're aching and you're slowing down, you can't do things, robbing all that life from the rest of your years. So GLP-1, back to one of the original points, is a hormone that has myriad metabolic benefits that any rational person wants to take advantage of. Next, then, would be, all right, how can we increase it? So firstly, I just need to say that natural foods will have that effect. When we eat food, that will have a GLP-1 effect, but not all food will have the same effect. A paper was published just 4 months ago in August of 2024 that had humans eat a meal that varied in the composition of fats to carbs. And then I'll describe this, then I'll get on to additional tools for leveraging GLP-1. So it was the same number of calories, that's very important, same number of calories, exact same amount of protein. One meal was higher in fat and lower in carbs, like a typical American diet. They've been telling, this one was a typical American, which is lower fat, higher carb. So this is kind of the standard American diet and global diet now. Don't eat fat, eat most carbs, and 70% of all calories consumed globally, in fact, do come from carbs. So that's what we're doing. So 2 meals. I'll explain it one more time. So one was the typical low-fat, high-carb, and then the other, same number of calories, was higher fat but lower carb. This diet, or this meal, eat and then measure blood, this meal, the lower carb, high fat, increased GLP-1  3 times more. 3 times more than the GLP-1 release from the high carb, low fat. So that alone should impress people, and it should make them think, okay, one, I want to take advantage of GLP-1. There's a better way to do it. I'm going to control my carbs, and I'm going to prioritize protein and not fear the fat that comes with that protein. That's the way to take advantage of GLP-1, not to mention just keeping insulin lower, which itself will increase metabolic rate. Now, beyond that, and no, that's the big ones. I mean, managing macros is key to metabolic health. Let me see how I can alliterate that even more. Manage macros to master metabolism. There we go. That's good. All right, but at the same time, there are other tools like yerba mate, which is Unicity. We have in review at the time of this recording in January 2025, we've submitted a manuscript for review where we found that Unimate increased circulating GLP-1 levels by 50%. So that is a substantial increase in GLP-1 from just one simple, indeed non-caloric stimulus. So the power there is, with the meal study that I mentioned earlier, the people are eating calories, and those calories need to be accounted for. Although insulin matters a lot as well in that whole grand formula of why we're getting fatter or leaner. What's unique here is that you're getting a GLP-1 stimulus, indeed, 50% over before consumption, and yet there's no calories that need to be accounted for.
Yeah, still in fasting mode.
Yeah, you're still fasted mode, and now it's going to be easier to fast because GLP-1 tells your brain that, hey, you actually are satiated.
Yeah.
You aren't hungry.
I mean, even if you're not fasted, right, you have this after you finish good additional GLP-1 boost, which helps you make that afternoon without snacking, cravings.
So there is human evidence, yeah. So beyond even the direct GLP-1 benefit of saying, look, I'm not hungry, I can fast more easily, even when you do eat, there is human evidence that has had humans take yerba mate with a glucose-heavy meal and look at what's called the oral glucose curve. Like, it's called an oral glucose tolerance test, where you drink a load of glucose, then you look at how much does glucose come up and how does it come down. At the same time, how high does insulin have to go, and then when does insulin come down? And the in-concert consumption of yerba mate with the meal, it brought those curves down. And part of it could be the author's time did not look at GLP-1. It could be that it is a GLP-1 effect. It could be a host of other molecules in the yerba mate or the Unimate, which is stimulating metabolic rate, stimulating fat burning or fatty acid oxidation. One report shows that fatty acid oxidation with yerba mate went up by 60, might have been 70%. So a huge increase in fat burning in the midst of, once again, taking some yerba mate. So there are a lot of mechanisms that come into play from the molecules found in Unimate. GLP-1 is the most famous at the moment, but we can't overlook just the old idea of, well, it's altering digestion a little bit. It's stimulating AMPK. Virtually every of the main molecules, the chlorogenic acid, the ferulic acid, the saponins, they're all activators of a molecule of a protein called AMPK. And when AMPK is turned on, everything gets turned on. So the body will have a higher metabolic rate. In fact, AMPK at one point as a drug target was called exercise in a pill. Because if you turn on AMPK, you're basically activating every pathway, molecular pathway within a cell that is turned on in response to exercise. So it was considered, and still is in a way, like one of the master metabolic regulators. And again, virtually every active molecule in yerba mate will turn on AMPK. Even at the risk of taking a tangent, but you did one earlier, so I'll do that now.
I'll go for it.
Even in the context of longevity, there's such a fervor for longevity nowadays. And in light of Stewart's quote that you mentioned earlier, the CEO, and my own sentiment, I actually think the fervor for longevity is a little misplaced, that rather than how can I add a couple years to my life, it should be how can I live better. But in the midst of all of this fervor of a focus on longevity, I look with such wonder that people are ignoring the metabolism of longevity. Longevity, in one way of understanding it, you could zoom into the level of the cell and say, the more I can have a cell activating this process of autophagy, where it's cleaning itself out, it's eating away its old parts and rebuilding them, that is autophagy. The more I can have autophagy happening, the more I can have this cell be robust. And the more my cells are robust, the more I'm robust. And now I'm more immune to the consequences of aging, and I'm going to live longer and better. Well, AMPK is what regulates that. If AMPK is turned on, autophagy is turned on, and longevity is going to be promoted. The more AMPK is turned off, the more you shut it down.
That's such a great visual to think, right? I don't know if other people ever have this show up in their timelines, but I always get like the occasional videos of people like cleaning a pool that's just like so dirty, or like pressure washing the patio and like limping this news out.
Like he's coming around always.
Yeah, I'm sure you lumber on it like it's like an ugly rug and they're just going over it, cleaning it out, and like it's just this rejuvenation and like and that's
I know that exact clip you're talking. Like a little rug, that's cleaning. You're mesmerized.
Yeah, you're
by the process of renewal.
And that's what our cells can be doing.
Oh, yeah.
As we increase this AMPK.
Yeah.
And when I learn those things, it's just like I can't get enough, right? It's like, oh yeah, I want to be having my Unicity first thing in the morning.
Yeah, I want to take advantage of that. Yeah. And an interesting another inclusion here is once again the relevance of insulin. Let me just state, lest anyone listening, somebody think, oh my gosh, Ben, can you talk about anything other than insulin? I can.
We don't want to.
But yeah, only because if you start invoking any principles of metabolism, you will never get very far from insulin. And if you have stepped away, it's because you did it on purpose. Every metabolic process in every cell of the body is influenced by insulin, AMPK and autophagy included. One of the reasons why I get so frustrated with longevity gurus is they just refuse to acknowledge the supremacy of insulin. And the irony is, let me just actually finish that point, then I'll come back to the irony. Insulin, when it goes up, it inhibits autophagy. It slams that shut. It basically puts a stick in those gears and says, you're done. Yep. No more autophagy, because insulin abhors a process of breaking down. Insulin only wants to build. Now, there's something good about that, but if you're only ever building, you will prematurely age. That has been shown convincingly. If you're not allowing the cell to take a break and go into what's called a catabolic state, there has to be a little breaking to balance out the building. That's the key to longevity. It's the balance. And that is what metabolism is. It's activating an anabolic effect, time to build. Now we balance it out as a catabolic effect. So AMPK is mediating that catabolic. Insulin hates that. It's only ever promoting growth, and thus death and aging. Now, back to the irony. The beginning of the modern focus on longevity started in a lab of a woman named Cynthia Kenyon, Kenyon. And what she found was that in these, I think it was fruit flies was her experimental model. You know, I use rats and mice and humans. She was using insects, fruit flies. And they found that if they fasted these insects from time to time, they lived like 50% longer, like a huge increase in their lifespan, relatively. Enormous. And then they knocked out one gene. So they reduced the expression of one gene and found that they could mimic this effect without having to deprive them of food. What was the gene? It was in the insulin pathway. So the very beginnings of our modern obsession of longevity from a more thorough, rigorous scientific view started with an appreciation of insulin. And now we've forgotten it. Now we've gone down the path of all the fake blue zones, which is all fake.
Yeah.
There's nothing valid. It's all faulty record keeping.
Yeah.
Lying to get early
pensions. Attentions.
Yeah.
Long after.
Yeah, man knows this now. Like the whole idea of blue zones, which has resulted in so much enthusiasm for vilifying meat, and you need to eat plant-based. Eating a diet, ironically, that is composed of foods that spike insulin all the time, well, that's a wonderful way to prematurely age and never allow autophagy to occur. So that's one of my hopes as longevity continues. It's not going to go away as a topic anytime soon of enthusiasm. I think we need to have a conversation saying there's a metabolic component here. The focus should be the metabolism of longevity. And the more you can, once again, be embracing lifestyle habits that are keeping insulin levels coming down, control carbs, prioritize protein, don't fear fat, frequently fast, and there are strategies to help that be easier. In fact, more that I haven't even got into, but I ought to revisit that in just a second. That's going to be the key to living a longer life. You want to remove the impediments to autophagy.
Yeah.
But the average individual who's eating a high-carb diet and they've been told to eat 6 times a day is living in a constant state of elevated insulin. No wonder they're getting fatter and their life expectancy is going to start to turn around, or they're going to have to rely on external interventions to keep them alive.
Yeah. And we covered now 2 elements of failure, where we talked about Unicity. And I think it's just a key distinction, right, of hey, you're not consuming GLP-1.
Yeah.
Right? There's no GLP-1 agonist in these ingredients that I'm drinking, because as we talked at the very beginning, even if you did consume that, it wouldn't work. It'd get broken down in your stomach.
You'll digest it.
But when I'm injecting myself, right? I'm trying to put that directly in. I'm hijacking the proper system, which causes all these, right, second order effects.
Yes.
Yeah. And we also talk on fasting and how that relates to, right, driving the same sorts of stuff we're getting from consuming this.
Yep.
But, right, the natural process of really leaning into that autophagy and the fact that 93% of us could stand to do a little less building with insulin, a lot more of the
Breaking.
Yeah. We have the one other element, right, in failure with balance. And, like, balance is an interesting product. It's been our core product for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there are cases, I think, where you could say, hey, as great as this product always is, like if I'm eating just meat, if I'm pure carnivore, I'm going to be able to have great health without adding balance in because my insulin's never going up.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like this comes to the point of like the food environment, the reality that we live in. Like most people would never do a carnivore diet.
No.
And if they tried it, they will do it for the month of January, right? Carnivore month. And then be like, okay, thank goodness that's over.
Back to the cake and cookies and
Right to the cake and cookies and sourdough and right, let's get running. And so balance has like this super critical role because our food is, burning garbage pile.
Oh, right, that's a mess.
Yeah. So how does the balance though, the functions of it play into what these other two pieces we've already talked about are given?
Yeah. Yeah, it is a nice compliment. So balance there are two advantages that I have been interested in as a scientist. One is the soluble fiber. Now, it is very important for people to note that not all fiber is created equal. That the bulk, it's a bit of a pun there, of fiber that people are taking is coming from insoluble fiber. And that is pure bulk. There's no metabolic benefit to the insoluble fiber. Soluble fiber is what really moves the needle. That's what's going to regulate blood glucose or balance blood glucose and insulin. And to really put a fine point on that, back to a balanced version of what I described with Unicity earlier, if you take a glucose load and you look at the subsequent glucose curve, if you take that with a balance, even right at the very moment, the same moment, in fact, drink that while you're eating that, then you will suppress that. There won't be as much of a load that's coming in and hitting the bloodstream. So the soluble fiber will balance out the glucose spike that comes from what you just ate or drank otherwise. But at the same time, one of the reasons why I appreciate balance, even in the midst of a carnivore diet, actually, which I, of course, had tremendous respect for because of how therapeutic it can be, is the production of short-chain fatty acids. Short-chain, so there's a little opportunity for some biochemistry here. Within the family of dietary fats, there's a spectrum.
Yeah.
And one way of defining the fat is how long it is. It's a series of little bound carbon molecules, like a string of pearls. The vast, vast majority of all fats that humans eat are long-chain fats. That's fine. That's not a problem. They're not bad. But they have the potential to be both burned and stored, which is fine. That's good. We want to burn them. We want to store them for later use. But the shorter the fat gets, we go from what's called a class of long-chain fats, which is up to 16 carbons. And as we go a little shorter, we get to the 14 and 12 carbons down to about 8. Now we call that medium-chain fats. Medium-chain fats cannot be stored. They have to be burned. And they're burned heavily in the liver, which means that the liver's burning a lot of fat. They make more ketones. So those fats are sometimes known as ketogenic fats. So people will take advantage of that by taking a scoop of MCT. Yeah, and coconut is the most naturally rich source of the 12, 10, and 8 carbon fats. Very solidly medium chain. But the medium chain fats actually go even further than just being a fuel. Again, they can only be burned. There's no potential to store them. There are also studies looking at them in their anti-pathogenic version too, where there are studies out of the Philippines to show if people have like various infections on the skin, coconut oil will kill the infection. And so it can be used even topically in a therapeutic sense.
Yeah, and people will switch it for...
Yeah, for oral health. Yeah. I mean, it has myriad benefits, but it was vilified for so long because of our collective fear of saturated fats, because coconut oil is totally saturated, which itself is a whole other way of defining fats that I'm not getting into. And then we go even a little shorter, down to 6 carbons and shorter. Now we've gone to the short-chain fats. In the modern human diet, those are almost totally absent because the only source of short-chain fats is through eating fermented foods. And we don't eat fermented foods anymore. We used to, but with the rise of processing foods and packaging them and the refrigeration principle practices, nothing gets fermented anymore. That's tragic for 2 reasons. Well, or 3, actually, if I can remember to cite them all over the next moment. One is that with the loss of fermentation, we don't get the protective effect of the bacteria themselves. So if we're eating something fermented, we have the bacteria, the probiotic that we're getting, these beneficial bacteria. But also, it's what they eat. When we've allowed something to undergo fermentation, the bacteria are eating the one thing we don't want, which is the starches and sugars. They don't eat the fats. They don't eat the proteins. They leave that for us. And that brings me to my third point, which brings me all the way back to balance, which is short-chain fats. Because when bacteria eat starches, they produce short-chain fats, which we otherwise do not get. That is our only source. But in humans, with our microbiome, we cannot eat the soluble fiber in balance. That's not a digestible source of energy for us, but it is a digestible source of energy for our microbiome. So we have bacteria that will see that soluble fiber, and it will say, I can eat you, and it will digest it, it will absorb it and metabolize it, and kick out short-chain fats as a product. Now, those short-chain fats themselves have distinct benefits. One, it can fuel the microbiome. There are other bacteria that will eat those short-chain fats to sustain themselves, which in the process actually helps maintain gut barrier integrity. So short-chain fats help the gut be tighter and not allow stuff to leak through as well. But then the short-chain fats and all that. Yes, exactly. Yes, so short-chain fats are therapeutic for leaky gut, helping the cells be tighter, having tighter junctions. And then lastly, finally getting around to my final point here, is that those short-chain fats will get absorbed into our bloodstream. And you wouldn't expect it because it's like this little guy is fighting in a higher weight class. But short-chain fats really punch above their weight, molecularly speaking, where short-chain fatty acids have been shown to directly improve insulin sensitivity. They have been shown to directly activate fatty acid oxidation or fat burning, and directly shown to stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis. So it's basically mobilizing every metabolically favorable situation in all the cells of the body and working in our favor. But again, unless you are eating fermented foods, very few people do, or you're getting soluble fiber, you're not getting them at all. That's an entire kind of class of food that you're not taking advantage of. Speaking of leaving tools on the table, why would we want to leave that on the table? Let's pick it up. Let's put it to work for us. And one last point.
Yeah.
Soluble fiber will stimulate the cells of the small intestine that make GLP-1. So once again, we can come back to GLP-1, a tool that otherwise we're leaving on the table. The more processed that food is going to be, the less of that soluble fiber it's going to have in it, in this case, and the less of a GLP-1 stimulus for one you get.
I'm glad we brought that up. I needed to hear that because I think a lot of people treat balance almost like an umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
Right, where it's like, it's raining, I better grab my umbrella. It's my protection from that.
Yeah.
And so, hey, I'm eating this meal. I know these things are not great for me. I don't want to bring up my blood sugar and bring up my insulin and be in that insulin elevated state for longer. And so let me use my balance to shorten that, bring it down, get back into a fasted, right, fuel burning state quicker, which is incredible. Like that's a much needed tool in the world we live in.
Yeah.
But like right now, January, I am doing carnivore.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll look at that and be like, hey, it's not raining. I don't need an umbrella.
Yeah.
You know, I'm fine.
Yeah.
And I've got these two tools, and one of them I'm like, hey, if I'm drinking it, it's better than when I'm not drinking it.
Yeah.
Like the more I can be drinking it, unless I'm trying to sleep, I want to be consuming Unicity because I know all it does.
Yeah.
But I'm leaving on the table this whole host of benefits, especially because it's so hard to get like raw milk in Las Vegas. So I'm not getting like fermentation from almost anything.
No, in fact, you know what? What's funny is the experience I've had this month. Like you, every January I do a carnivore month. I do it for two reasons. One, I find that throughout the year I just start to get a little chubbier and I want to check that back. But at the same time, I want to check my habits. I hate feeling like I'm addicted to certain foods or practices. I don't like feeling like that. And this kind of recalibrates my addictions. One thing I love ever since my days in Russia in the mid-90s is something in Russian called kefir. And we here in America, we say kefir.
Okay.
But it is just a fermented milk, sour milk.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. About a week ago or so, I don't even know what possessed me to do this. My weak time of day is the evening. In the evening, like I am strict, not even remotely tempted to eat anything unhealthy until about 6 p.m. And then it's like some little beast wakes up inside of me, some Tasmanian devil from the old Looney Tunes cartoons, and it is just driving me, it's tempting me constantly. So it's the evening that I've had to really develop some strategies for. Again, I don't know what possessed me to do this. I took some kefir, which is fairly viscous. It's thicker than milk. I did half and half water and then half kefir. So it's a bit of a less viscous version of kefir. I took a balance, put it in and mixed it up. It is like the most delicious orange smoothie. And it has been the single most effective tool to control my evening appetites than anything I've ever done. And I have tried, I have been so struck over the years of the hypocrisy of being me, one, knowing more about metabolism than most people, and two, still finding myself creeping back to stupid habits where I know I shouldn't be doing this. And believe me, my wife there's no end to the grief she gives me where she says, "What are you doing eating that? You shouldn't be eating that. I'm going to post a picture and put it on your Instagram profile so everyone knows how much of a hypocrite you are." I mean, no one keeps you honest like your spouse, right? But it's something I've always struggled with. But just even that is a reflection of the difference between knowledge and action. You can know what you should be doing and yet still struggle with it. Evening has been the bane of my existence. I would have an Adonis-like figure if it weren't for my evening temptations, where too frequently I would find myself indulging in something I know I shouldn't. But when I got onto carnivore January 1, knowing I would do it, I actually started a couple days before because I think I had such just metabolic mess from Christmas. I thought, I'm going to start this early. I can't go another day without tightening things up a bit. But once again, I was finding evenings really, really hard and miserable. And I'd get angry and cranky because I was just trying to do anything I could to not walk by the pantry and grab out the cereal or something. On a whim, I swear it was divine inspiration. Water, kefir, and then I would put in a pack of Balance. I'd blend it up. It is like an orange fruit smoothie. It's absolutely delicious.
So you tried it with orange. I was going to say, ask if you tried it with an berry.
I haven't. I bet that would be delicious.
Yeah.
I'm going to, before I leave Las Vegas today, I'm going to leave with some mixed berry, and I'm going to try it tonight.
Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna try that because
you're gonna try and you're gonna say Bikman is a genius because it works.
I'm sure. I mean, right now I'm getting all my joys from Jell-O.
The gelatin at least allows you to feel like you're still carnivore.
It's carnivore. It is, follows it. But so one more topic I really wanted to get into. All right, and we can go over anything else that you might want to share that I haven't covered. But right, so we have a lot of people who've been doing the fill rate protocol or a fill rate system for months or even years and have had like incredible results. I mean, I've seen. I want to show you one that I just got sent recently by a good friend, Vasti Rivera, and it's one of the most impressive ones. So this lady's been using it for 18 months. Maybe we can even have Terrence show this when we put the video together. Have that up there. But this is her before and after of 18 months. She's down 144 pounds.
Oh my gosh!
Right,
144 pounds.
Yeah, and she says, right, that's the only thing I've done. I've added that in. And haven't like by adding it in, definitely she made other kind of adjustments as she went along, right?
Oh yeah, sure. But that's almost part of the point.
Yeah, that's the point.
It's that no one's claiming this alone is all you need. No, well, it's going to help, but it also is facilitating better habits. Like I mentioned earlier, I alluded to cravings. Well, bitter tastants are known to help with cravings. Theobromine and saponins are known to tell the brain you actually don't need that sweet thing. So it ends up becoming part of a big toolkit. What you think is only 2 tools, before you know it, you're actually holding on to more than you ever imagined.
Yeah.
You just didn't expect you could hold on to them.
Exactly. Like right now, I'm fasting. I did a hard workout this morning. I kicked my butt. And I forgot to eat when I came in here. Because I had my Unimante and I just feel good.
Yeah.
I probably should get some protein in me, but
You'll be there.
I'll get there. So, yeah. And so she's had this incredible, right, change. And with that, though, she has, right, lost a lot of weight. And I think that there's a lot of people who feel so much more mobile after, right, going from being obese to being super healthy.
Yeah.
And they're thinking, okay, well, what's next, right? And it's that, what we talked about, again, like the muscle building, the muscle development, and how much more life that has into years. Really nice. Dr. Rhonda Patrick, she's one of the people I love to follow on X, and I could dig through and find a clip, but she was talking about how that's one of the biggest predictors of longevity is
Muscle mass.
Muscle mass, yes. And so I just wanted to get your input as someone who is very passionate about that topic on, like, what would you advise someone who says, hey, whether I'm at the beginning of my weight journey and I want to be really conscientious of this, or I'm 18 months in, 2 years in, and I'm kind of ready for the next steps of leveling it up.
Yeah.
Where do they focus? What are like some simple things like start to incorporate?
Yeah, no, what I like about this is it suggests a sort of natural evolution. And an individual, Vasti, is that who it was?
Well, Basti sent it to me.
Yeah.
Right. Her name is Lola.
Lola. So Lola, her first strategy, there's an evolution here, which is, okay, the tissue I'm targeting is my fat tissue. Now, these need not be separate things. You can do them in concert with one another. But in her case, there's this kind of elegant evolution that occurred, which is I'm targeting my fat tissue. Okay, mission accomplished. 144 pounds down, for goodness sakes. Now it's time to lean into lean mass. I need to strengthen. I need to manage my muscle now. How can I do that? So I do think that is the strategy that people should focus on more than, I don't want to say that this is unfortunate, but I almost want to, but I'm not going to. People will often say, okay, it's time to start running. Now I'm going to run a 5K, now a 10K, now a marathon. Yeah, I actually think that is not the best use of time. That the better use of time should be, how can I build muscle? Because that doesn't build muscle. Most people might not appreciate that. I'm not saying that's unhealthy, but it's not how fast can I run 10 miles that predicts longevity. One of the most consistent variables is muscle mass and strength. That is probably more consistently than any other physical attributes that will predict longevity. Strength and muscle mass. That should dictate our decisions when it comes to how am I going to spend the next 30 minutes. Now, there are numerous ways that someone can engage in resistance exercise. And my quick answer would be the best one's the one you'll do. Because different people, you're going to have a different ability and access to workout than me, perhaps. In addition to interests, like if you go and do CrossFit in a loud, raucous gym, I hate that kind of environment. I like a very quiet environment. I don't like high-velocity weightlifting. You may love high-velocity, swinging the bar around. And I know tremendously fit people who do that. I don't like it. And if I had to go do that in that kind of culture, I wouldn't last very long. I like very slow, very thoughtful workouts where it's purely body weight, for example. So anyway, the best way to train to build muscle is the one you'll do. Now, having said that, I do think there are some principles that I've learned over the years that may be relevant, born both from my own experience and from evidence to support it. One concept, though, that I would want everyone to appreciate is this idea of time under tension. So typically people will say, okay, grab your dumbbells, and now you're going to do 3 sets of 12. And they don't even really think about what they're doing. They're just counting 1, 2, up 10, 11, 12, and they put the dumbbells down. What they're not doing in that is being very mindful of the muscle. First of all, the dumbbell curl is a silly exercise, and I don't encourage people to do it. And I'll maybe revisit that in a moment. But in the midst of the movement, be mindful of the way the muscle is moving. and thinking, am I contracting that muscle maximally? Like, for example, the way I work out is I think of I only do complex movements. And I think of them in two categories. I'm pushing or I'm pulling. Whether you are pushing or pulling a weight, or whether you are pushing or pulling your own body, every movement, upper body movements, lower body movements, can be put into those two categories. I'm pushing the weight or pushing myself away from something, or I'm pulling something towards me, or pulling myself towards something else. That's how we can categorize movements, and I would encourage people to look at that in that regard. Because after all, what good is it having big biceps from doing bicep curls if you don't have the muscle in the back, for example, in the upper shoulder, in order to actually move that thing? You know what I mean? Like any movement in nature where I'd be closing my elbow, I'm pulling something towards me. And that's going to be more involvement of shoulders and back. So that's how I want to train that muscle. I want to train it as part of a group. So I'm not generally an advocate of isolation exercise, just on principle. So you think of every movement as a push or a pull. And then my own workouts have evolved to a point where I don't even count the sets anymore, a repetition. I don't count the repetition. I will just go until I can't do another one. And that allows me to kind of be in a very thoughtful place, like where you were listening to videos earlier. I will listen to podcasts. I will sometimes, it's a mix. I will listen to a podcast, I will listen to a book, or I will listen to some religious, like scripture or some other kind of religious message. All part of this kind of edification. Like when I was learning Russian in the mid-90s, I became very fluent in Russian very, very quickly. I even surprised myself. In Canada, I'd studied French for years, and I kind of hated it because I was from Western Canada. But it was very laborious and tedious, and I don't think I learned it any quicker than anyone else. I learned Russian so remarkably quickly. And in hindsight, I think it's because I had developed this practice of waking up very early and working out in my dumpy little apartment in the middle of nowhere, Russia. I'd do lots of push-ups in particular, and I would literally have notes in front of my face. And I'd be reciting things in my mind rather than counting the number of repetitions I was doing. And so by not counting, my brain was free to do something else. In this case, meditating or thinking about principles, thinking about my family, thinking about what I was listening to. Like right now, I'm listening to a book about the rise and fall of the Persian Empire. And I'm absorbing it.
Did Dan recommend?
No, one of my brothers did. It might be the same book Dan had in mind. But it's fascinating. But anyway, I'm able to do that because I'm not counting. I'm not focusing on how many am I going to do. I'm just going through these movements until I can't do another one. Or it becomes so uncomfortable that I'm starting to grimace and my form's going to start to falter. Okay, now I'm done. And there was a paper just published finding that going all the way to true failure, like I literally can't do another and I need someone to help me, had no better benefit than going to about 1 or 2 repetitions away from that. So a person can feel justified in saying, oh, my form is really getting sloppy. I could probably do one more, but I'm going to start to grimace and groan, and I don't need to. And you don't.
Yeah.
So you can be very thoughtful and almost meditative about the exercise. But I'm getting almost a little too philosophical here. So I would encourage people to break up the body into its 2 main parts, upper body, lower body. And then on upper body, break up your movements into I'm pushing or I'm pulling. That can be as simple as I'm doing push-ups. It can be as more or a little harder. You have to have a bar, but I'm doing pull-ups, push-ups or pull-ups. Or if you have weights, it's of course easy, but I encourage people to do complex movements rather than just say a bicep curl. And there are a lot of ways people could do this. Bent over rows, shoulder presses, military presses with just light dumbbells. Legs. It is, if you are squatting up and down, that's a push. If you are leaning forward and hinging forward and backward and working the back, that's a pull. Those are the pull muscles. And so those can be done in a number of ways. In my case, as much as I like to do body weight-based exercises, when it's legs, I do use kettlebells. And once again, reflective of my old Russian past. Because I remember a time when kettlebells were only a Russian thing. And I remember looking at the kettlebells in the mid-90s in Russia thinking, those are the most bizarre things. And I never would have, I wish I would have bought stock in kettlebells in the mid-90s. I would have been retired by now because they've become so popular. But I'll use kettlebells for my legs. But even still, It's pushing and pulling. I will generally just go through. I don't even often have a set number of repetitions anymore. I will just basically say, I'm going to continue to go through this. I fail, I rest a little bit. I do it again. I do it again until I just think, I don't want to do that one anymore. I'm going to do something else now. And I'll typically give myself about 30 minutes. What's so remarkable is that I'm almost 50 now, and I certainly am a little smaller than I was at my peak at maybe around 25 or so, but not a lot. I am just about the same proportions of skeletal muscle as I was 25 years ago, and yet I spend less time now. It's odd. That shouldn't be the trend. It should be that I have to work harder and harder. One, my nutrition's better.
Yeah.
I eat much better protein. I eat much better fat and other facilitative tools that just help me generally be lean and healthy. But then second, I'm so much smarter. My workouts used to be, here's my workout. I'm doing 3 sets of 12 of bench press, 3 sets of 12 of military press, 3 sets of 12 of leg curls, whatever. I don't do that anymore. I just will say, I'm gonna do, often I do a cycle. Maybe this will be my last point because I've gone on long enough. I actually kind of circuit through it. And the easiest version of this is my upper body routine, which is I will hop up on the bar and I will do slow, perfect form all the way down, all the way up pull-ups until I cannot do another one. And then I drop down to the ground and I do a narrow grip push-up, slow, methodical, really pressing in and out until I can't do another one. And then I will have 2 light kettlebells and I'll do lateral raises until I can't do another one. I rest for just a moment, 30 seconds tops, and I do it again. And then I do it again until I've done it 10 times. And that usually takes about 20 to 25 minutes, and I am absolutely done. And then I go on with my day.
Yeah.
And that takes me 25 minutes, and I used to do an upper body routine for an hour. And again, maybe I was a little bigger, but Cheryl doesn't notice, and if my wife doesn't notice, then no one does.
And that's not right. Even our concern with it, I think it's really valuable to get that insight into what's going to help me get my muscle built up.
Yes.
Right. So Unicity, we're the Make Life Better company. We've decided our best way to impact that is by helping people with their metabolic health.
Yes.
And so Belgrade is hyper focused on helping you go from being insulin resistant to insulin sensitive and metabolically flexible.
Yes.
But muscle mass is another component, and it's one that we're looking at a lot. All right, we've got a convention coming up, working closely with you to bring different speakers there. Right, the products that can be released. So a lot to look forward to on that end. But in my conversations, I think a lot of people when they start Belgrade, exercise is pretty far out of their mind.
Oh yeah,
it's hey, let me see if this gives me a step up.
Yeah,
and when they see that it does. Right, then they start to think, well, what else might I be capable of? How else could I achieve? How healthy could I get? Right, and we love that. We love empowering them to start to see that. But I've noticed a lot of people who are really heavy, their first thought of exercise is to start walking, and walking is great. I would never tell anyone not to walk.
That's right. Yeah, the best exercise is the one you'll do.
Yeah,
but there's better.
Yeah, and so I think that's a really helpful thing to have people understand is hey, I'm going to go walk, right? Or I'm going to find opportunities to walk. If I'm going to do a call, put in my AirPods, right? Go walk while I do it. But also, can I find 15, 20, 30 minutes to, right? Even if I'm starting by leaning against the wall.
Yes.
My push-ups against the wall.
Or doing wall squats to work on quads. Yeah.
Yeah. I hold on to something and I'm pulling myself toward it, right? And so that can really help. And I think part of the reason why some people are hesitant to do that is because of what shows up on the scale as they start to do that.
Right.
And
yeah, because muscle's heavy.
Yeah.
Yeah, muscle is composed of so much water. It is a very dense tissue. So you're absolutely right. One person who's only stepping on the scale may, in the midst of both losing fat mass, but maybe gaining a little muscle, not be happy with what they see. All the more reason to not ignore the scale, but keep that number in check. I would strongly encourage people to do this. Do some circumference measurements.
Yeah, we try to encourage everyone, hey, when you start your feel great, focus on the numbers, but not just the number on the scale. Measure your weight.
Yeah, measure your waist, measure your hips, measure your neck. And then if you think you might be doing some muscle gaining, measure your upper thigh, measure the the biggest kind of belly of your muscle, of your biceps. Yeah, there are a host of those circumference measurements which will absolutely, one, they're simple, but they'll tell you way more of what's happening than the scale.
Yeah, we always want to encourage you to like put it to the test. Like think, hey, where do I want my body to change with what I'm doing?
Yeah.
And measure that. So you know exactly, it is changing. These things are happening as I'm using it. Like, go get your A1C tested. Yeah, a lipid panel. So you can see 3 months from now, oh my gosh. Like I can show it to my doctor. Yeah. Hey, let's de-medicate me.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you've had me on these pills, and I don't think I need this one anymore and that one anymore, and the doctor will review that. But my advice then, as much as you and I both are aligned saying, look, whatever exercise you're going to do it. Any is going to be better than none. But I would say for every unit of time, as much as you can start, even if you have to cut into the walk, if you're going on a walk, you have time to do some resistance. Even in the midst of that walk, my own workout nowadays is kind of a weird little hybrid, but this is reflective of what I'm talking about. I wake up very, very early, and I will put on a 30-pound vest and I'll grab 10-pound dumbbells, and I will hike 1 mile up a hill while I'm listening to scriptures and 1 mile back down. It is beautiful. The world is dark. It is quiet. It is cold. It is one of my most favorite habits because of just how quiet it is, and it wakes me up. And the rest of my day is just going to be dynamite. Now, in the midst of that, like reflective of my point, I will take little breaks from time to time as I'm climbing up the hill, and I'll drop and do push-ups. So even in the midst of my walk, although it's a ruck, because I only weighted down, I will stop and do push-ups. And so anyone listening, if you've just been walking, awesome. That is a wonderful first step. Let's start to take it up. It's time to start prioritizing your muscle mass. And just do it by stopping and right there in the middle of the sidewalk. People will think you're weird. Get down and do as many push-ups as you can do. And then get up, shake it off, and keep going. And then maybe 5 or 10 minutes later, do it again.
Yeah, or start bringing the backpack.
Weigh yourself down. Just increase the load, where that is the key to muscle building. You have to be loading the muscles a little more than you are. And walking is great. Jogging is great. But that's not going to do enough to build muscle. But muscle, one point I wanted to make, you teased my brain and made me think of it. As much as we're talking about it in the context of just the variables that predict longevity, muscle is hungry. Back even to earlier parts of the conversation with glucose control, when we take, anyone who's ever worn a continuous glucose monitor is used to seeing the glucose come up and then come back down. When the glucose starts to come back down, 80% of where that glucose is going on the way down is going in the muscle, if you've got that muscle mass. And so the more muscle you have, the more you have these hungry mouths to feed. And so if glucose is coming in, it goes right into the muscle. The muscle will greedily pull it in, all the more so with exercise. When you exercise, those mouths just open up wide and glucose comes in without insulin needing to tell it to do anything. So this is an insulin-independent way of pulling glucose from the blood into the muscle. But the less muscle you have, then you eat that glucose load, and the glucose doesn't have anywhere to go. It doesn't have all of these mouths to go into, and so the glucose will go higher and stay higher for longer. Of course, underlying all of that will be an insulin load that has come up and stayed higher for longer too, further exacerbating insulin resistance. So one of the critical keys to improving insulin sensitivity, getting back to all these other principles, allowing autophagy to be active, allowing fat loss to occur more readily, promoting longevity, you've got to get your muscle big. So you need the stimulus of exercise, and no stimulus is more powerful than exercise. But then you need proper nutrition to fuel that growth that the muscle wants to turn on. So the muscle will have a stimulus saying, I'm going to turn on, but what am I going to, I'm going to build, but I need building blocks to build with. So make sure your nutrition is sufficient to facilitate that.
Mm-hmm. All right. I said that was the last topic, but I have another question that it will be very helpful for a lot of people. And so for people who are type 2 diabetic or pre-diabetic, and they're very aware of their blood sugar numbers, right, throughout the day because they're monitoring this.
Yeah.
And they start to make a substantial life change, right? Whether that's starting to use Filgrate and adopt that into their just daily lifestyle, whether it's starting to plan intermittent fasting, with that or without it, whether it's, moving to a keto or carnivore-based diet.
Yeah.
And so they make a substantial change, and they start to see some crazy variations in their blood sugar, right? Where, it's higher in the morning than it used to be, or it dropped more in the night. Like, this is out of the norm for me, and more so than I'd want, right? Because it's like, it's slowly going down. I think everyone's happy, to a certain extent. But these bigger swings, what would be your advice for those people, right? Because we know these are good lifestyle adjustments, and it's sad to think someone might throw it out because, like, okay, this is out of the norm.
Yeah.
I'll let you advice.
Yes. So first of all, that does happen. There are, for lack of a better term, we could say that there are people who kind of hyper respond in that regard, where what should be an intervention that is lowering glucose, and very often that is what happens. There are people where you find that paradoxically their glucose is creeping up, or their HbA1c, their A1C marker, an indicator of thought to be an indicator of long-term glucose controls going up. But how can this be? I'm not eating any carbs. There are a handful of factors that could be playing into this. My lab actually is in the process of analyzing what is an enormous data set, so it's taken way longer than I intended, because we had people wearing CGMs. And CGMs just give you, as an aside, there's so much data that you almost don't know what to do with it all. We've had to recruit a full-on biostatistician to help because it's more stats than I know what to do with. But we initiated this study to try to better understand why is it that some people adopt a low-carb diet and in the midst of this find a paradoxical increase in their blood glucose. Interestingly, these people, this is unpublished. Yeah. So we've not submitted this for publication yet, but what our early results find some people have higher levels of glucagon, one of the first molecules I brought in this conversation, than other people. And these people who are adopting a low-carb diet appear to have this exaggerated glucagon response. Now, and thus it's pushing glucose higher than you would have expected. Why not just stop at normal? There are and then this sort of allows me to transition into the endocrinology of a low-carb diet. There are a handful of hormones that oppose insulin. Insulin is the almost singular hormone that will want to decrease blood glucose. Well, if blood glucose goes too low, you could die. You got to have normal glucose, which is nice. The liver makes glucose, which is why you and I could be carnivore and have normal glucose levels, because we make all the glucose we need in a healthy person. But insulin is so powerful at lowering glucose, there's actually a little mob of hormones that seek to oppose insulin and increase blood glucose levels. Glucagon is one that I mentioned. And again, we had evidence to find that in some people, they adopt a low-carb diet, and for reasons we do not yet understand, their glucagon goes up. And if glucagon's going up, that will increase glucose to a degree. But glucagon alone is not sufficient. Insulin is too strong. In this tug-of-war, this being the lowering glucose, this being the increasing glucose, insulin, if it was just insulin and glucagon, no, insulin will crush glucagon all day long. So a glucagon needs some help. It has help. There are other hormones, like growth hormone. Growth hormone, we think about growth hormone in the context of growth, justifiably because it's named growth hormone, and yet that is remarkably inaccurate. Growth hormone is actually a fuel mobilizer. It wants to fuel growth rather than stimulate growth. There are other hormones called the somatomedins, which actually stimulate growth, like make the body get bigger and taller. Growth hormone mobilizes the energy, including blood glucose, to fuel that growth. So along with glucagon, we have growth hormone. And it still doesn't end there. We can bring in the stress hormones, which makes them sound bad, but if you don't have stress hormones, you die very quickly. That is cortisol and epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. Cortisol and epinephrine also go up when dietary glucose is down in order to help maintain glucose. So it takes these four characters to yanking on the rope in order to just balance out insulin, because insulin is so strong. Now, back to these four characters. Each of these does go up in a fasted or low-carb state. All of them climb to some degree, although cortisol will go up and it will come back down. But over the course of a day, at night, growth hormone is going to be higher. And so in some people, it could be that they have an excessive growth hormone response to with the stimulus being there's no glucose coming in. And that may make some people at certain times of the day have a higher glucose, or the cortisol or the epinephrine are a little higher, or the glucagon, as my work suggests, is a little higher. So for reasons we don't yet know, some of these characters that are wanting to offset insulin are just going a little too far. I'm certain in time we will have a better answer where I can say we do know why they're going higher. But in the meantime, I have to only end my answer there. That some of these insulin balancing hormones, they go a little beyond where you'd expect them to go in a normal context. And thus, the glucose levels have creeped up when you would have expected them to creep down because I'm not eating carbohydrate. But it's all about the endocrinology of metabolism, which is a beautiful system within the body. But all the more reason not for people to just focus on the calories, but wonder, with what I'm eating, what will be the consequence of my hormones? And then maybe one last point that I've elaborated on in various venues previously. Conventional clinical care obsesses over A1C. They will look at A1C and let that dictate all further clinical decisions. That's unfortunate because A1C, as much as it has been viewed as a marker of glucose control, there's another character involved in that story, namely the red blood cell. Because A1C is a measurement of how much of your red blood cells have been glycated. And a friend of mine and scientist named Paul Reynolds, with whom you'll be speaking later, his expertise is glycation, the process whereby glucose has irreversibly bound to a molecule. Well, that can happen to hemoglobin, which is the main oxygen-carrying molecule within a red blood cell. So they will look at A1C and say your A1C is higher. It's 6.5%. That's diabetes range. You need to change your diet. Some people see when they adopt a carnivore diet, their A1C will go up a little bit. They say, oh, that must be because my glucose is higher. And yet in many people, it's not. Their glucose is great. It's because their red blood cells are living longer. That's the other part of the equation that is totally overlooked. We say A1C is a marker of glucose. I could just as justifiably say, no, it's actually a marker of red blood cell longevity. That if your red blood cells are healthier because they have healthier fats in their membrane, they're more resistant to exploding and dying in the typical 120 days. Maybe the carnivore's red blood cells are living 150 days because they're just so healthy. Well, it's just a little more likely that the longer the red blood cell lives, it's just going to get glycosylated at some point. That doesn't kill it. It may compromise some of its function, but even in the midst of being a carnivore, you have so much more iron. Your red blood cells are more robust than ever. It's probably, in many people, having an elevated A1C on a carnivore diet is probably what we call in science an artifact. It's not actually a real finding, or at least not in the way you think you're seeing it. It's not an indication, I would submit, of elevated glucose, but rather an indication of very robust red blood cells. So you have what we would call a false positive, that your glucose levels are fine. This marker is just an artificial, it's not actually reflecting the situation. But there's a flip side to this, because while we have a carnivore who has normal glucose but an elevated A1C, actually indicating healthier red blood cells, you could have the opposite scenario where a person has avoided all animal-based products and is purely adhering to a vegan diet. Well, veganism will kill a person. Like, let's just make that clear. You will have nutritional deficiencies that you need to be mindful of. Now, this person eating only plants may have an elevated glucose level, but a great A1C. But this A1C is now a false negative. It's not actually reflecting what is a problem because they are so deficient in iron, which you cannot get sufficient iron from plants. They're so deficient in vitamin B12. So they not only may have an iron deficiency anemia, but also something called pernicious anemia, or also referred to as megaloblastic anemia, because of the lack of B12, which you can only get from animal foods. That now their red blood cells are really fragile. They're not living long enough to get glycosylated. And so their A1C is artificially low, even though they actually have higher fasting glucose. So you have one group getting the false negative and being adored by all pop culture and all the influencers who think we should be plant-based. You have another group who has an artificial, a false positive, being vilified, saying, well, see, you're killing yourself and causing diabetes anyway. Meat really is bad, and so you should avoid it. And in reality, there's this beautiful kind of nuanced physiological battle or event happening within the body that's just really a reflection of how healthy and robust are your red blood cells.
Yeah, and so at the end of the day, right, the person who's trying to say, I don't want to feel this way. I want to get out of this situation. I don't want to be type 2 diabetic. I don't want to be pre-diabetic, right? I just want to be metabolically healthy, right? There may be signals of things going in your body, but those aren't signals of, hey, this intervention necessarily is harming you. This is your endocrinology is adapting to the new inputs that are coming in.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, so even adding to the first part of how you ask that, yes, a person may say, I don't like this trend towards diabetes. It could also be, boy, I got a blood test telling me that I have fatty liver disease, or I can sense that my mind is not as sharp and I'm getting some cognitive decline here, and this scares me. Remember, all of those problems have a metabolic core. And so when you change your metabolic health, you should expect some changes. Like, for example, you earlier mentioned metabolic flexibility. That is a concept, and it's a beautiful one. I like it. That is intended to describe the shifting of the metabolic hybrid engine of the body, shifting between fats versus sugars or blood glucose. So it's blood sugar being burned or it's body fat being burned. And the metabolic flexibility is the idea of I can shift back and forth. I eat a mixed macronutrient meal with carbs and fats and proteins, at least because of the carbs. I'm going to have an insulin spike, which pushes my body into sugar burning mode. And then hours later, I've digested this. My blood sugar's gone back to normal. Now insulin has come down and I shift to fat burning. That is metabolic flexibility. The scientists who first articulated this idea went on further to describe a scenario of metabolic inflexibility, where even when the person had entered a fasted state, they hadn't eaten in 6 hours, you are fasted at that point, they should have gone to fat burning, and they don't. They're stuck sugar burning. This is metabolic inflexibility. I have proposed an idea where when someone has adhered to a low-carb diet for a long period of time, they actually kind of have a reverse phenomenon occur where they're not stuck, but their body has so adapted to fat burning that if they start to load in carbs, it will take longer to clear those carbs because the body is in fat burning mode, which I contend is a much better place to stay. But if you spontaneously load the body with some carbs, it will take longer because you're not quite flexible into sugar burning, which isn't a bad thing. But maybe one last point on this is it's possible, and these hormones that I mentioned earlier, glucagon, growth hormone, cortisol, epinephrine, would play a part of this. But maybe a person gets so they're so accustomed to fat burning and very few carbs coming in that there's a rebound of some of these hormones, one or two of them, where they've just gone a little too far. And now the glucose is being stubbornly elevated. But that's because you're not burning glucose. Now, I would submit, I've never seen it get to a point of harmful.
Yeah.
It just may be, well, that's high. That's 100. That's higher than
Alarming. And it's like, that's...
Yeah, it's paradoxical. I'm not eating carbs. Why is my glucose at 100? First of all, 100 is perfectly fine. Not that I'm someone's clinician, but there's no reason to get upset about low hundreds when it comes to blood glucose levels. But that might itself be a reflection of, boy, your body's just so focused on burning fat that it's just taking longer to get around to those carbs because it's not relying on those as its primary fuel.
Thank you. I think it's very helpful information for people because we have so many people that are helping others make some of these lifestyle transplants, right? They seem like does. I want to help with those people.
Yeah, of course.
Which, I mean, there's so much more we could talk about. I mean, one of the topics I was considering was what you're doing with ADS and, right, the total corruption of ADA. I mean, I know I didn't say that I think the big pharma are fully corrupted, but ADA I think is,
Yeah. Well, I mean, just briefly, I'll elaborate on that. Yeah, I mean, it's been very discouraging for me as a scientist to try to look at the rate at which change happens or it doesn't happen. But yeah, a lot of what I alluded to earlier is that you have vested interests in societies and organizations, even within biomedical science, where these entities just they refuse to the American Diabetes Association is so stubborn in not acknowledging the decades of evidence suggesting that one of the best things you can do in diabetes is just cut carbs, because that's not a great way to continue to get funding. And so, if I'm
Coca-Cola.
So it's funding from sources that both increase your blood sugar and funding from sources that want to drug the blood sugar down. Working with some others like Dr. Ken Berry, we created the American Diabetes Society. Anyone can learn more by just going to AmericanDiabetesSociety.org. We're creating kind of a counter to this, which is going to be no funding, no donations, no sponsoring from pharmaceutical industry. It will purely be from individuals and from corporate sponsors who are more in the real nutrition and or lifestyle. I mean, that's all the same. Within the lifestyle space, that's going to be the aim, so that we don't have any clear vested interests. Now, someone may say, well, you're getting sponsored from this company who makes a particular food product. And our response can be, yeah, great, use it. That's the solution. The solution is food. It's changing habits. It's changing lifestyle. We don't want people to look at least type 2 diabetes and say the solution is this next drug. No, but if that's the entity that's paying us to keep our organization alive, then we're going to say that. No, we're not going to speak on behalf of any individual company. It will be, yes, we're taking money. We receive money from individuals and corporations, but only if those corporations are mission aligned, which is to say they're promoting changes in lifestyle to promote better health.
Yeah. What I've learned about the American Diabetes Society is, I mean, your goal and your focus is not what you see in the American Diabetes Association or some of these other ones where it's like, hey, we're going to help people maintain this situation.
Yep.
Like, who wants to maintain it? No, I know. We want to get it better. And so your focus of like, hey, let's educate and help support people and cure it. Hey, let's get rid of this. Let's eradicate it entirely.
Yes, and that is a way of describing the disease that you will not hear in conventional care. Like I said earlier, they can only say this will manage your diabetes. No, we want to reverse it. And you can. We've published a paper to that effect from my own lab using the nutritional principles I outlined earlier with managing macros. Others have. Dr. Ken Berry, one of the founding members of the society, he's done it in his own practice with hundreds of people now. Most of these metabolic problems are diseases of lifestyle. So the food we eat, like I said earlier, is either the culprit or the cure.
And maintenance in many cases, maybe all, maintenance is a myth, right? Yeah. It's I'm working on progressing, or I'm falling behind.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, pure static is death.
Yeah.
Like, so change stops. Like within the realm of biology or even physical sciences, if there's no change, it is absolute zero. It is death.
Yeah, and in business, if it's like, hey, if we're not focused on growing, if we're like, hey, we're satisfied, we'll stay here, you're actually being left behind.
Oh yeah.
And so you look at the government and all these things like, hey, we're trying to manage our chronic disease situation. And what has that gotten us in the last 40 years? A way worse chronic disease situation, right? You have to fight it. You have to say, oh, we're going to turn the tables. We're going to cure, right? We're going to look on eradicating this. And so that's such an amazing focus that you have in the ADS, and definitely recommend people to check it out.
Yeah, well, it is further evidence of my desire as a scientist to not let good ideas just sit within the realm of a peer-reviewed paper. If it is a good idea, it is incumbent on me in this instance to take it out of the little narrow ivory halls of academia and put it into the real world. And if it doesn't survive in the real world, then it's a bad idea. But these ideas have a life, and they need to be shared. So this kind of venue is delightful for me because it allows me to teach these principles and have that gratification of knowing the idea is now going to live in someone else's brain.
Well, a lot of the people that will watch this interaction are aware of your other stuff, but for anyone who's not, in any other places you'd like to, direct them to say, hey, if you thought this was helpful, here's where you can.
Sure. Yeah. So just it's so fun for me with Unicity. Just by way of background, this was the first venture that ever came my way to do something outside of academia. It actually, my involvement with Unicity as a scientific advisor happened before I'd kind of evolved, like I mentioned earlier, that evolution where I thought, all right, I got tenure now, and now what? Yeah, now I want to start to really see if these ideas matter and take them into the real world. So that has been a very gratifying part of my career to share these messages with people who are very enthusiastic. I remember the first talk I ever went to, if you'll allow me to wax personal for a moment,
before it.
for Unicity, I remember being so startled at hearing people clap, after a talk. Because as a professor, no one claps. Even at scientific meetings, when you give a presentation, no one claps. They don't care enough to be that enthusiastic. And I looked at this group of people and these bright, shining faces and thought, wow, they really care. And it was touching. Like, it was very personally touching for me. Anyway, I'm a scientific advisor for Unicity, which is the longest standing outside of academic effort I've had in my career. But I also like being a teacher, so people can find me at benbikman.com. I have a lot of my educational content goes there. That's a little more personal. And then they can find me on social media, but also I've written a couple books. Why We Get Sick, which is all about insulin resistance, what it is, where it comes from, why it matters. And then a follow-up book called How Not to Get Sick, which is more of the interventions on how to improve, how to really reverse insulin resistance through lifestyle.
Yeah. Well, I feel super fortunate myself. I think there's a lot of people who are jealous that Sam gets to be the person to sit down and ask whatever question. They'll be kicking me like, why do you ask about this or this or this? And it's like, hey, well, this probably won't be the last conversation, right? Send me the other questions. If they're good ones, I'll ask them. If not, I'll ignore them.
That'll be round 3.
Yeah, that'll be round 3. But thank you for coming into Vegas, having this conversation. Been a pleasure.
My pleasure, Michael. It's all mine. Thank you.